Rather than covering any particular economist, let me start with a general question. As we move from the time of mercantilist thought into early classical economics, which were the ideas that end up being developed as analytical engines, and which are the ideas which turn out to be too hard to develop or spread? One idea that definitely gets developed is that of the so-called invisible hand, by which the selfish actions of some individuals, under some circumstances, give rise to a greater public or collective good. This idea has a number of roots, including some of the French Jansenist thinkers, but it becomes pretty commonly found during the time of late mercantilism in the late 17th century, and you see it pretty clearly in writings by Dudley North and Nicholas Barbon. We have separate videos on each of those two. It's very clearly in place by the time of Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, 1776. Smith's essay on the grain trade is really a marvel of invisible hand kind of reasoning, and because people were understanding some version of the invisible hand, the general idea of benefits of trade gets built into classical economics pretty early on and pretty solidly. Another idea which gets developed pretty clearly is the distinction between real and nominal variables. And you see writers struggling with this in pamphlets in the 16th century and even in a lot of the 17th century. But by the time we get to the middle of the 18th century and the writings of David Hume, say on money, Hume pretty much nails this completely. He understands that when the supply of nominal money goes up, you might in the short run have economic output and employment go up, but in the medium term or somewhat longer run, prices rise, you no longer have an increase in the real money supply, nominal variables have adjusted, and the real changes have pretty much gone away. It was really a hard-fought victory to get to this point where Hume arrived, but nonetheless you can think of this as one of the most important points to have come out of 17th century British economic thought. From Hume onwards, large numbers of writers on economic matters understood this pretty clearly. In general, during the transition from mercantilist thought to classical economics, writers are figuring out the notion that macro results can differ from micro results. For instance, holding money is a form of wealth for a particular individual, but it's not necessarily wealth for the community as a whole, because money is, of course, a claim on the goods and services of other people. There's also a growing understanding of the notion that one man's expenditure is another man's income, and you even start getting some arguments which resemble very early version of Keynesian economics. You see that in Sir James Stewart, the Scottish writer, in the middle of the 18th century, and you also see it in the writings of Malthus. When it concerns issues of real and nominal, macro and micro, one thing people really still didn't get, even often well into the era of classical economics, was the difference between real and nominal interest rates. This is stated very clearly by Irving Fisher in the early 20th century. We still call it the Fisher effect. There are numerous times in classical economics writings where you see people recognize the distinction, but overall you simply can't count on economists to get this one right until really quite late in the history of economic writings. The classical economists also worked pretty hard toward an understanding of what it meant to have an equilibrium between costs of production and market price. So they understood that if market price is above costs of production, more will be produced until you get some mix of the costs going up or the market prices going down, reestablishing an equilibrium. This is pretty clear by the time you're reading Smith's Wealth of Nations, and it's extremely clear in David Ricardo, but it's worth pointing out that while they have an acceptable mechanical model of how costs and market prices are related, it's not really the full complete theory which the neoclassical economists later developed. They didn't have a perfect understanding of supply and demand and how they're interrelated, and they didn't have a perfect understanding of the margin and an idea of marginal cost. So the classical economists put enormous energy into this question. They got somewhere with it, but still they didn't really quite nail it, even well into the period of classical economics. Similarly, the classical economists put in a lot of energy trying to figure out theories of factor prices. What determines what is paid to labor, what is paid to land, what is paid to capital. When you read the mercantilists on these topics, they sometimes have good insights, but they don't have systematic analysis for the most part. It's really quite murky. But when you're reading Smith, Ricardo, Senior, Mill, many other writers, this is a kind of obsession of classical economics. Unfortunately, just like they didn't quite get right the relationship between market price and costs of production, what they develop is an analytical apparatus. It has some virtues, but it's not really the same one that the neoclassical economists are working with much later in the 19th century. And there are some major debates among historians of economic thought, basically asking, well, how much did the classical economists actually really understand a neoclassical apparatus? They just had different terminology. That's an argument that's been made by Samuel Hollander and others. Those are interesting claims, but I would just say this. The very fact that the question can be debated suggests that the classical worldview, when it came to distribution and factor prices and relationship between costs and market prices, it just wasn't clear, and I think often in their minds they had a kind of muddle of classical and neoclassical models, and sometimes they got it more right than others, but this remains an area where, for a long time, economic knowledge is fairly imperfect. Finally, let's just consider a few nominations for what wasn't developed as we move toward classical economics. And I have a few nominations. I'd like to suggest the idea of transactions costs, as we later find it in Coase, a systematic analysis of strategic behavior and how it relates to economic problems, and also what we moderns would call economics of information. But be very careful when I say these points. You can always find classical economists, and I would say most notably Adam Smith, who have striking insights into exactly these topics. Strategic behavior, you find it clearly in David Hume, you even find it in Rousseau. So it's wrong to think of these ideas as absent from the thought of the classical economists, but I think there's a difference. There's not a systematic working out of the analytic implications of these ideas in the same way that, say, the classical economists try to analyze the relationship between costs and market prices. So you can find these ideas, but they don't really, to my view, become part of the analytic core of classical economics. Anyway, that's just a very brief overview of what ideas ended up being developed in the transition to classical economics and which ideas were not really fully developed.